Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all today at the launch of our ESG Talk, our new webinar series fully dedicated to sustainable investing. My name is Naïm Aboujaoudeh. I'm the CEO of Candriam, and I really wanted to thank you personally for being here today. It is wonderful to see such a large audience joining us to this event. This shows that the number of people willing to act for change is growing and is growing fast. This makes me really confident for our common future. The topic which will be discussed today is very close to my heart. As you all know, for so many years, the E element of ESG has been on top of the agenda for our industry. However, the pandemic has driven a renewed focus on the social aspect and highlighted just how interlinked we have the E and the S together. This is what our panelists are going to talk about today. How can we achieve social inclusion in a low carbon future? How can we have a positive impact on the environment while making sure that no one is left behind? How can we ensure a just and fair transition? At Candriam, this topic is not new at all. Earlier this year, we partnered with London School of Economics and a team led by Nick Robbins, who is here with us today. The aim of our partnership is to look at how investors can accelerate climate action with positive social impact, and to ensure that the just transition remains a core part of companies and a main part of the society as a whole. We plan to publish our collaborative work in the coming months in order to be ready for the COP26. Our ambition here is really to advance the global investment industry's effort toward a more sustainable and inclusive economy. On this note, I would like to thank you again for your presence. A big thank you for our panelists. Thank you, Karim, Nick, Wim, and to you as well, Gillian, for accepting to moderate this event. I'm confident that our speakers will provide you with a constructive and insightful discussion that will leave you with a stronger conviction in such an important issue of our time. Thank you for your presence, and I would like to turn it over to Gillian.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me okay, Naïm?
Yes, it's perfect. Yes, Gillian.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, sorry for a few technical glitches, everyone. I'm going to try and get back on a better platform in a minute. But before I do, I should just say how delighted I am to be part of this event today, which is discussing a very important issue, and an issue that in many ways is the next natural transition of the debate we've had about ESG in recent years. We've heard a lot about the need to tackle climate change. That has dominated the ESG, the E part, but increasingly the pandemic has shown us the importance of trying to put that drive into a wider social context and made us recognize that you can't really do just the E without looking at the S and the G and thinking about what is just transition. So we have a fantastic group of people to talk about this today. We have Wim Van Hyfte, who is Candriam's Head of Sustainability Investing. We've got Professor Nick Robbins, who's a Grant and Research Institute at the LSE. He runs that, and he's been a really powerful voice talking about these issues, and particularly developing the concept of just capital, just transition. And we've got Karim of Solvay, CFO, who's going to give us a corporate perspective, looking at how this impacts on the financial side of anyone who's trying to run a company today. But I'd like to start with you, Nick, and ask you, what exactly is this concept of the just transition? Why is it needed, and how do you define it?
Well, thanks very much, Gillian, and it's great to be with you all. So the just transition has been around for many decades. It actually came out of the labour movement, and really it's about putting people at the heart of the process of economic and industrial restructuring. It's mentioned in the heart of the Paris Agreement, and I would say it's one of the critical success factors for making progress on the Paris Agreement, getting to a zero carbon economy and one that's resilient. So two big aspects. One is about seizing the socioeconomic opportunities of the transition in terms of more jobs and in terms of better jobs in particular, sort of quality jobs, decent work, and so on. So that's one. We know the transition actually is going to lead to more jobs in the energy sector. So that's one. So how do we do that? And particularly, how do we diversify those opportunities, particularly in terms of gender and region? And then the second is also, how do we face up to some of the social risks of the transition? What does this mean for particular workers and communities in particular sectors? Are we going to have a risk of stranded workers or stranded communities alongside stranded assets, which obviously investors have been thinking about? So in terms of the agenda, it's really about putting the social dimension at the heart of investors' climate action, and in a sense overcoming the silos that have existed, I think, in the past between the E and the S of ESG. So I mean, it's a broad agenda, a strategic agenda, focused on the workplace, extending to the communities, and many businesses, investors are also thinking about what does this mean in terms of fairness for their consumers as well. But I'll leave it there, Gillian.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Now, Wim, I'm curious, for a company like Candriam, how important is it to look at just transition rather than just the ESG issues, which most investors tend to talk about?
Thank you, Gillian. I think it's a very important aspect of what we're starting to realize, certainly after the global financial crisis, is that many things are connected. And obviously, certainly in sustainability, Candriam has been involved for over 20 years, myself being also on the fund management side. What I've seen in sustainable investing is that we tend to think in silos. But if you look at what the just energy transition actually means for an investor, certainly as Candriam, is that first of all, it's transition, so it's a journey. It's not something that is static, it's dynamic. That is very, very important that we realize that. But because it's a journey, obviously it needs to be planned. And if it's a journey, it also impacts many people involved, because we're talking about transition from, environmentally speaking, sectors that are highly exposed to fossil fuels to something different. I don't want to put it from a perspective of something bad to something good. It's just a transition to something we've had before, where people are employed, so there will be an impact on employment, to something new, so that it will create a lot of opportunities, risks and opportunities. Candriam as an investor plays a very important role, because it's not only about the journey itself, but it's mapping out where do we see those risks and where do we see those opportunities, first of all. Secondly, proactively reacting. And then thirdly, offering solutions, meaning, and that is very important for an investor, it is not only about divesting, it is also accompanying those companies that need to transition to a more sustainable model. And I think for investors, and certainly Candriam has played a very important role and has been very vocal of the last few years, that when we talk about the COP21 Paris Agreement, so the 2-degree objective, that transition is key to what we do, and we need to manage that. So E, certainly, but, and that is, I would like to stress, it can only be successful, and as the last thing I'm going to say, I think it can only be successful, that transition, if it's accepted by the people. And obviously the people, these are the employees, so social objectives could be the most real or material threat to net zero carbon economy. So as an investor, we need to be aware, and we need to integrate that into the way we talk to companies and the way we assess companies.
Right. Well, that's very interesting, because I think in many ways the Gilets jaunes protests happened in Paris last year were a wake-up call for people about the fact that actually it's all very well for, you know, liberal elites, as they sometimes say, to be embracing the E factor, but if you don't get wider buy-in, then that can actually impede changes and actually set things back. And of course, with the pain of COVID-19 and the economic shock, not just in developed markets, but the emerging markets too. That's doubly important now. But Karim, I'm curious, from the point of view of a company, how do you see this at the moment? Because the chemicals industry is obviously a big employer, but traditionally you've also been a big target for environmentalists. I know you're doing a lot to try and address these issues and to transition, as Wim has just said. But how does just transition play out for you?
Thanks, Gillian. I think this is a very difficult question to answer, but I'll do my best. As a CFO of Solvay, 5 years ago, I would never have dreamt of being in a panel like this. And what changed is that we started to look at how do we define value creation. You know, I'd been to the Porter's School or the 5 Forces, profits, cash, and returns, and I realized, maybe a little late, that this is not going to be adequate. So we integrate E and S, and differently G, in our definitions of value creation. Now, as you rightly say, we are a very energy-intensive industry, chemicals is, and yes, we can be encouraged or come under pressure to manage our energy intensity. We do that. What is different in Solvay, which incidentally is 158 years old, which doesn't come by accident, is we have a very clear focus on the social aspects. Our founder, Ernest Solvay, had this vision around providing free healthcare for workers back in the 1800s. And we perpetuated that. So the S part, the social part, is a part of who we are. Not as a nice to have, not as part of our marketing, or no, it's who we are. So back in 2018, for example, we said for everybody in Solvay across the globe, we want to have healthcare, medical insurance, invalidity insurance. So make sure that we go beyond the local requirements. This is just part of who we are. So my point is, we cannot afford to focus just on the financials, obviously, not only on the energy intensity, but the social aspect is a key part. Now, as it happens for our company, it's directly linked to our purpose as a group. So it's very easy to integrate that into every key decision we make. It doesn't mean that we are the most socialist and sort of about employment. What it does mean, however, is because you're running a business, and we have to be sustainable in our capacity to generate profits, reduce risks. But it means we integrate those factors. It means we engage in meaningful dialogue with our social partners, with the unions, to embark them and not just impose decisions on them. It's just a different way of working compared to my previous experiences in a more Anglo-Saxon environment, 6 years and before.
Well, Karim, I was just because I can tell you that in any American debate, simply by virtue of having an English/European accent, I'm often accused of being a socialist before actually saying it.
Ooh, I think we may have lost Gillian here. Is this just me?
No, we have lost Gillian.
So apologies to all. We've had 1 or 2 minor technical glitches. I'm sure this will be put right.
Yeah.
Wim, perhaps you want to take on and maybe continue the dialogue between us?
I'll take it on, but I think it's I was planning, maybe Nick, you can maybe start, but then Karim, I would like you to elaborate a little bit on that, because obviously the just transition is very linked to the social part, and it's also to communities in different regions. And obviously because Solvay is a very global player, you're obviously also exposed to both the opportunities and the risks it brings. But maybe Nick, if you can briefly elaborate on what that actually means, the different communities, the different regions from a just transition, and then maybe Karim, you can respond to that, because obviously we talk about Anglo-Saxon Europe, very different in the way we look to S, that social part. So Nick, if you would be able to elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I think, Gillian, we were just sort of talking, getting down into talking about the sort of the regional dimension and so on. So I think there may be two things to think about. One is actually the transition obviously is happening in different speeds and intensities in different parts of the world. So certainly industrial regions which rely on heavy industry or fossil fuels and so on are going to be particularly affected. And so one of the aspects I think which is a key aspect is, as well as looking inside the factory fence at workforces and so on, also looking at the wider community impacts in terms of what does this mean for particular regions and so on. So a sort of a place-based dimension is really important to this. But then I think also in terms of actually how policymakers are taking this forward, clearly we see the European Union with the Green Deal. The just transition is a key part of that, with a particular mechanism which has been in design for many years now, a just transition mechanism to provide public, but also importantly to provide in private finance into those regions which are going to need new forms of job creation, new forms of value creation to go forward. And then we may want to touch on actually the whole developing country and emerging market piece, which I think is really important as we go forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the question of emerging markets is really rising up the agenda right now, because certainly, you know, COVID has been hitting those regions very, very hard. At the very same time, there's growing awareness that in order to get any kind of hope of tackling climate change, you're going to have to get the emerging markets on board. And that's where just transition really comes into this key in particular. But Wim, I'd like to go back to something you touched on earlier, which is, I think the use of the word transition is a very powerful one, because, you know, there's a growing awareness that actually you can't talk just about saints and sinners or green and brown assets. You need to find ways to try and create a pathway for companies and investors to move along. Is there anything in particular that sparked you from your financial perspective to think about just transition recently? And how much is it about the pandemic?
It's not an easy question, because obviously the pandemic is first of all, it's a humanitarian crisis, and it brought to the forefront that aspect, obviously. But what I think is what I highlight with that transition is well, obviously it's a journey, and a journey that is something that you plan, and you plan it because you want to proactively estimate what comes along and how do I need to deal with that. And obviously and I think Karim will definitely can talk about that, but it's not only for companies, it's for companies and investors. That plan is so important, because transition, like I said, is a journey, but here it's a very long journey. If you talk about that Paris 2-degree objective and the 2050, so realizing by 2050 being carbon neutral, well, that is still 30 years ahead. But it would be naive to think that we can achieve that objective from 2040 to 2050. It is now we have already locked in quite a bit of emissions. So planning now is very important. Realizing that nobody will be immune. So we're really talking about something that is going to be impacting all sectors in some way. And very, very different here is, while the pandemic, I would say, has transformed or turned the humanitarian crisis into a real labor market crisis, impacting many sectors, many countries too. I think what we see in terms of energy transition is that certain sectors will be more negatively exposed and negatively impacted, and their job losses will be very material, while other sectors will offer a lot of opportunities. And some sectors will definitely need to transition completely, reinvent themselves, while I believe, and maybe Karim can talk about, I think chemicals and industrial sector is typically a sector that will be an enabler in that transition in offering solutions. So that means, from an employment perspective, that we need to think about new job, different types of job, reskilling, re-education. So that's becoming more and more important.
Right. Well, I'm going to come back in a moment and ask you about some of the specific ways you benchmark this and what exactly you're looking for. But Karim, would you like to comment on that? Sure.
I've got two comments. One is, I want to build on what Wim has said, but focus on the fact that urgent action is needed today and can be done today. I'll give you an example. We're talking about the COVID situation. There is so much hardship, not just in emerging countries, but everywhere. We know it. So I don't believe that business can afford to stand still. Now, different companies do different things, but to bring to life the S in Solvay, what it means, many executives have donated part of their salary. That's nothing to shout home about, and many employees have followed suit. What I'm particularly proud of is the fact that we invited shareholders to sacrifice a part of their dividends to create a solidarity fund to alleviate the hardship related to COVID. This is for me an example, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of others, where businesses and investors together are creating what I would call responsible capitalism. So you not penalize them. And I think that to me is quite key, and that can be very impactful today. So that's one. To Wim's point, I can only agree, but part of me in business, my timescales, even in a 150 plus year old company, is not just 23 years forward. There's something around the need to move faster. And what I find is, as a CFO of a group, is I welcome what the International Business Council of the World Economic Forum has done in publishing the 21-22 key ESG KPIs. Love the fact, really welcome the fact that the PRI and the World Business Council of Sustainable Development is collaborating essentially to create the framework whereby investors, companies, and hopefully regulators will say, we need to create that framework to facilitate, I'm going to say accelerate what we need, which is exactly that just transition. That's what I welcome. It requires us to be very transparent, to have whatever we publish audited so people can trust it. There's no greenwashing. And I think these are the fundamental elements that we very, very strongly advocate. It's one of the reasons I'm here, hoping some of the audience today will feel compelled and intrigued enough to jump in and start to challenge companies and asset managers to integrate it into everything they do.
But one of the things I often hear is that, you know, you can measure the E factor because you can look at, you know, the actual emissions, you can work out what a carbon price would do, you can get quite tangible and quite nitty gritty. How on earth do you turn the S into a tangible accounting framework? And I should say, by the way, I can see there are some fantastic questions coming in already, which I'm going to start pitching to the panelists. If anybody is watching and wants to ask some other questions, do please submit them through the Q&A function. Incredibly simple and easy to use, and we'll pick them up and we'll pass them around in a moment. But I'd like to ask all three of you, how do you actually go ahead and measure that slippery S factor? Because one of the, in fact, American regulators joked to me the other day that S should actually stand for slippery.
I'm happy to kick off by admitting that I don't have a complete and compelling answer to your question, Gillian. It doesn't prevent us from trying. There are things we can measure. How engaged are our people? That we can look at our talent attractiveness. So, but these are tiny, tiny elements. The reality is we find it much easier to measure, compare, contrast, and benchmark a lot of the E aspects. The S is very, very difficult. Part of me doesn't need to measure every single thing to get off and move. I'll be frank. I'm happy to go based on beliefs and what we need to do as responsible leaders. But that's also why I welcome what the IBC is putting forward in terms of the ESG, the 22 KPIs of E, S, and G. I think this is a beginning. And rather than wait for a perfect, complete, comprehensive framework, I'm pushing to embrace, adopt, get going, compare, contrast, improve. It's not about showing people how good you are, but learning from others so we can improve. That to me is what this is really all about.
Right. And just quickly before I toss to, I'll ask Nick that question as well, and Wim, do you employ SASB or TCFD or any of the other alphabet soup acronyms to measure what you're doing?
Yes, and we're very early movers because we believe that transparency, consistency is key. So TCFD, we're in the very first wave. IBC in our annual report this year already, in March, we said we're there and we're ready to comply. We simply can't measure 3 of the 22 KPIs. So we're not going to wait because we believe it's right. But my experience is this isn't enough. I'm going to share with you exactly why, because even though investors are far more engaged and curious and asking questions, they're not using the metrics, they're not challenging, and they're not able to compare enough. So to me, disclosure is a key part, but adoption, education, use, compare, contrast is the next opportunity that I think will help to shift the needle as well, because there are too many metrics.
Wim, do you think that's fair that investors aren't using the metrics correctly? And do you feel like you're drowning in alphabet soup?
Well, I think Karim has a fair point here. If you look and compare to FRS or US GAAP, obviously sustainability reporting is still in its infancy, so it's very early days. However, I do believe that these type of standards are going to be key for adoption. Otherwise, nobody will be able to use them. And I think the resistance is, and it boils down to, Nick, obviously you're in the academic world, so my background is also in the academic world. It boils down to what we have been educated with. We have been educated in the finance, certainly in finance, with financial reporting systems. Everybody feels acquainted with that. Everybody can use it. But if you talk about environmental impact, social impact, well, sorry to put it that simple or to put it that blunt, but employees are being reduced to one line in a reporting standard, which can't be the case. And luckily, Solvay too, and many companies have evolved in their corporate sustainability reporting. But from an investment perspective, many fund managers still feel unfamiliar with how do I actually use that corporate sustainability reporting into investment management. And so there's quite a bit of work to be done on teaching, education. And secondly, I would say the fact that people are not inclined to use it is because it's so diverse. Companies do not know what to report on. Investors do not know what to use. And thirdly, and that is something very important, S has always been a very delicate issue. Social is a delicate issue. It's not rocket science. It can make, you can have a very different perspective on a social issue just because you have coming from different regions. So kind of articulating what social mean within each sector of each industry, well, there needs to be help from companies too, I think. Karim, you are in the chemical sector, you know better than even myself or my colleagues what is key. So it needs to be driven also by companies that start reporting, although it might be limited or it may be still patchy in terms of the quality. It's better to have transparency, and based on that transparency, work towards a standard that can be accepted sector by sector.
Right. I mean, I'm curious, Nick, you have a good overarching view of this, and you don't have skin in the game directly, as it were, apart from being one of the champions of the just transition concept. But do you think it's time to basically bash heads together and get, you know, one single accounting standard that actually can try and capture this to clarify the issues, or is that just going to be impossible?
I think we see that convergence happening, and I think Karim has listed many of the initiatives on the broad ESG. But again, I think if we look at what the just transition is, it's about where the E and the S meet. So one of the things I think would be a good place to start would be for companies and indeed financial institutions in their TCFD reporting frameworks to consider the just transition element in those key factors. So in terms of the governance dimension, so to what extent in the governance of your climate plan are your workers, are your employees, communities involved? In terms of strategy, what is your strategy actually about human capital? What is your strategy around skills and so on? And then clearly risks. Where do social risks arise in your strategy and so on? And then there is a question of metrics. Clearly, again, as we've heard, on the climate side, it's much easier to have a carbon footprint or a temperature alignment. But I think that's perhaps this question of sort of just transition metrics is where actually we could focus on a few areas which companies could report on. I think it's significant just in the last month that the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, this very important collaborative of investors around the world, has included a sort of just transition in question for the first time as part of their net zero benchmark. So for me, that's significant in two ways. One, the just transition is now a core part of investor corporate dialogue. And secondly, it's part of a net zero benchmark. It's not a separate free-floating abstract thing, but it's part of the how are companies going to deliver this? It's the how question. So I think that's very significant.
Well, that
very briefly, because there's a lot of high-level talking to, but in the end, it's also about what happens on the ground, and that is absolutely key when you talk about measuring. But if you see, like, for example, the Workforce Disclosure Initiative, it's a very nice initiative that actually should be aligned with what Climate Action 100 Plus tries to achieve on the E side, well, that workflows disclosure initiative is actually challenging companies on reporting, both from a governance perspective, but most companies do feel familiar with that because it's about strategy, representation, but also in their direct operations about re-education, about development, about safety, occupational health and safety. These are things that we need to start reporting on, also from that just energy transition perspective. And just one example here, which I'm not going to put the name on it, but there are a few utilities companies in southern European countries who have been very vocal on explaining how they're being impacted by transition, first of all, economically speaking, and how they have dealt with that from an employment perspective. And that should be leading examples for other sectors to take on board and start reporting on.
Right. Well, that leads very nicely to some of the great questions we're getting. And we are getting a lot of absolutely terrific questions. We got a question here. Since there is no official standard, what do you recommend to keep in mind when analyzing different ESG data providers? How do you go around shopping for the best standards or making sense of them? And what do you think it would take for the markets to agree on standards so that ESG data becomes comparable and hence more reliable? That's such an important issue. Any of you like to jump in on there?
I'm happy to start a response. I think this is an outstandingly important question. I believe that if we can get asset managers, industrial companies and regulators to align on what is it that matters and define, maybe they take the IBC's 21, 22 KPIs on ESG. If we just start with that and say, this is what we will impose, expect, require disclosures, and we all commit to integrating and using them in our decision making as corporates, as asset managers, I think that would be a tremendous step forward. Ultimately, I think this is what we need to land towards. I think it's really important to have independent rating agencies assessing the veracity of one's disclosures, and be it the risks on the one hand, but also the opportunities on the other. We should not forget the opportunities. And at some point, maybe we can turn to circular economy, because it's such an important aspect. We forget the carrot is more motivating than the stick in many ways. But what I want to say is this: by standardizing, by having a clear common language, independent verification, I think we can reduce very well-intended multiple initiatives, reduce complexity in the system, and facilitate the conversation between investors, companies, really facilitate capital allocation in a way that is much more responsible and effective, without necessarily suggesting that this only impacts the longer-term horizon, because I think there are very short-term considerations to take into account as well. So my personal view is, let's start by standardizing, even if it's imperfect or incomplete, and focus on what is material.
Right.
Otherwise we end up with 600-700 questions, which is what we have to contend with. And we know 90% plus is simply not relevant or material.
Right. I'm going to turn to a poll in just a second, but before I do, Wim, do you have a view on that as to how you try and navigate the alphabet soup?
Well, I have to admit that sometimes I feel sorry for the companies that have to reply to all this kind of service coming out of all the data providers. Obviously, we use them, but the point I made before is during a conference, a roundtable that I was on too this week, I said, like, be careful with this kind of, we have all this kind of data agency and we buy them all, where we use parts of it. But be careful, because on the same subjects, you can have very diverse rating recommendations. It's simply because this is not something that has been written in stone. It is a qualitative judgment on an information that was provided by a company, and those rating agencies just interpreted that. But that is then used as something very objective, and that is not always the case. You have different data providers who have different views on the same issue. So what is the issue here? It's very simple. There's no objective reporting framework at this stage. So all these data providers send out their own surveys with their own views to companies, and they report on that, and we trying to find our way in those reporting frameworks. So reiterating my point, the necessity to have a standard, one uniform standard reporting framework on E, but certainly also on S.
And I think it's important to have that convergence of reporting frameworks, but actually I think a diversity of assessment. Actually, we don't necessarily want, markets don't work where there's a single view. And I think actually having people who actually look at the information and come up with different views on the information, I think that's potentially healthy. And we know we don't want to have a sort of a single mindset, but actually people interpreting this and saying, actually, this company is probably further advanced than we think, or actually not as far. So I think sort of convergence on reporting, but actually let's actually have a diversity of assessments.
Right. Well, that's a very good way of putting it. We've got some great polls. I'm just going to check that the audience is still awake and listening and see how many of you are engaged, because we have some polls for the audience at this point, which I think will spark some more discussion and more questions. If you look on your system, you can probably see one coming up. We're going to start with a poll, which is, should financial markets fully integrate ESG into capital allocation? I just launched that and it says yes, no, or don't know. I'll give you all a couple of moments to think about that. I would love to have a geographical breakdown of this if I could, because there was a very interesting survey which we wrote about in Moral Money, which is the FT's newsletter that looks at these issues just this morning, which shows that there's a quite stark divergence between US and European investors on this point. But it seems that certainly out of those who are watching, 90% of you, I'm going to show you this now, last call for votes, 1 or 2 more coming in. Okay. As you can see, 90% of you think that you should be launching, fully integrating ESG into capital allocation. We're going to do the next poll now, which is also linked to this, which is who can best help to accelerate the just transition? Do we think it's governments, investors, corporates, or all of them? Let me quickly put those up. Who can best help to accelerate the just transition? And interestingly here, okay, I'm going to end now. I think people, interestingly enough, didn't vote quite as quickly, so it may be a slightly harder question. You probably all know instinctively you want to incorporate ESG into capital allocation now, but interesting to ask who should be doing it. And in fact, most of you think that all of those groups should be doing it as part of a collaborative effort. And just going to do the last poll while we're polling people. And the last poll is, how importantly do you think an unjust transition would impact your portfolio of assets, i.e. how much would you lose if you didn't actually try and have some just transition dialogue? No impact, medium impact, huge impact, or don't know. So I'm going to launch that poll now. Okay. Right. Okay, so I think you out of that, 48% say that it would have medium impact, and 27% huge impact, and 23% don't know. So interesting pattern here, that the overwhelming majority of the people watching, and by the way, I should say that, you know, a very large proportion of people watching actually did vote, so you care about this. Overwhelming proportion think that it is time to integrate ESG factors into your capital allocation. An overwhelming majority think that it requires business, government, and companies to get, and financial sector and NGOs to work together for just transition. And you think that on balance, it would have some impact, most of you, if you did not try and do that, but another proportion of you think it would have a huge impact. So I'd like to ask you, Nick, what do you think about that? Does that surprise you?
I think those are really, really interesting results, and I'm actually surprised by the engagements. I think the first one on ESG is, I think it's fairly straightforward now. But I think actually the sort of mixed results, particularly in terms of who should be taking action, I think is an interesting one, because in a sense, with climate change more generally, governments need to take action. This is a market failure. We need to price carbon. We need to promote used industries and so on. And on the just transition elements, let's say sort of skills and training, that's partly going to be a government role, partly corporate. And again, investors can encourage strong corporate action in terms of skills and retraining and so on. So I think that sort of middle pole, I think, was very interesting to show that actually the key part of the just transition is identifying the relevant zones of responsibility. And the question was about governments, investors, and corporates, but obviously working with other groups. And Karim mentioned social partners, trade unions, civil society, communities as well. So I think that was a really sort of honest result. And then the final one was interesting in terms of, I think a lot of people's not quite sure, but also very small numbers saying it's going to have no impact. So I think actually people recognizing now that actually the unjust transition, majority of people saying will have some impact, huge and medium being the largest ones. And so I think that lays the basis for actually some very practical action, particularly by sort of business investors and policymakers.
Right, interesting. I'd like to maybe ask a question to Karim at this point, which is really picking up on some of this, which is that someone's pointed out that the IBC framework that came out, a lot of the ESG discussions have been quite American or Anglo-Saxon in their focus in terms of framing this purely in terms of risk management and benefits to the bottom line. Whereas in France, there's recently come out a very interesting proposal from the AFG with 16 asset managers, which have set out a series of indicators for companies to look at, which is taking a less utilitarian approach to the whole thing, talking more frankly about the circular economy and things like that. Now, Karim, I know you said earlier you wanted to touch on the circular economy. Do you want to reflect on that, about what it means to be operating out of Europe, where you're not necessarily dominated just by Anglo-Saxon metrics?
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. Thank you, Gillian. I think for me, there's a couple of things. One is, let me tell you a bit about Solvay. It's my only main reference I understand quite well, but half of our portfolio of businesses are very much part of the solution from an E point of view in terms of water, CO2, energy intensity, etc. So it really responds to the new societal needs that we have. Now, what I find very, very attractive as a finance expert, as a CFO, and hopefully as an investor, is that what we find and what we learn is that part of our business grows at an average of 3 to 4% CAGR, more than the rest of our portfolio. So having the right relevant solutions is very virtuous in terms of profit creation, value creation, put it simply. That's one. If we go one level below that, we know that 7% of our turnover today is genuinely defined as circular economy. We're very engaged with Ellen MacArthur and the foundation there. We've committed to doubling that in the next 7 years. Simple. Not because we think just it's good. Yes, it is good, but it makes such good business sense. My point is, yes, one can look at E, worry about the risk, and we should. The climate risk is here. But there's a huge opportunity that comes out of that as well. And the other remark I would make is we shouldn't, I think, be too narrow in our definitions of E and S. If I look what's happening around us, droughts, fires, water scarcity, these in many ways are actually linked, I'm not a scientist, but to climate risk. So I think, and they create a lot of social faults, ultimately, fault lines that we see everywhere. So I think the distinctions we give ourselves between social and environmental become blurred over time. And we actually have to work towards that, which is why really focusing on making the most of the resources that we have, recycling, have a very closed loop on how we do business, actually I think is the only way forward, fundamentally. It's a big ask, but I think everybody can make a big change in that respect without sacrificing financial value. And that's what I find particularly compelling.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, there's a question following on from that, which I'd like to give to Wim. I'm going to keep moving through the questions if we can, because we have so many fantastic ones now. From Catherine DeLong, by publishing a carbon-adjusted EPS, Danone, for example, tries to raise awareness that this transition will reduce profits for a period, whereas many investors still focus on bottom-line results. What's your view on this, Wim? Do you think more companies should do that and be honest and say, well, actually, what we're doing will reduce short-term profits for a while. And do you think investors are willing to tolerate that or accept it or have the maturity to recognize what a carbon-adjusted EPS actually means?
I think the idea is fantastic, to be honest. I think how imperfect it might be, I think it's the way to go. It's like thinking about, you put a carbon price on your emissions and you disclose to investors what a carbon price would mean in terms of cash flow generation, in terms of energy generation, but also in terms of revenue opportunities. Because like Karim just said, if he says like more than 50% or nearly 50% of his portfolio is a solution, well, there it will have a positive impact. So I would highly encourage, even if it's still, like I said, I prefer transparency to no transparency. I prefer disclosure to no disclosure. So even if it's imperfect, I would highly motivate companies to start reporting on that. That is the first thing. In terms of that perspective, short-term having an impact on EPS, it's kind of the big challenge that we face in our, and it's one of the critiques that I've had over the many years I've been a fund manager, is that we have the feeling that because of quarterly reportings and semi-annual reportings, we have the feeling that we are better informed. That might very well be the case, but that might also be not the case, because what these quarterly reporting is actually trying to achieve, I don't know. It's not on a quarterly basis that you explain a strategy, and it's not on a quarterly basis that you explain to investors how your business model, your governance, your strategy is aligned what you see in society, because the economy serves society in the end. So I do believe that there needs to be also reflection on, if we talk about reporting frameworks on the financial side, there needs to be reflection on what we're trying to achieve here. There needs to be a much more longer term view, and not that I want to sell Candriam here, but we have been very vocal on supporting thematic trends, talking about circular economy, talk about climate action, talk about healthcare. I think these are not strategy about your quarterly reporting and your EPS the next quarter. This is about, where is this company going and why do we want to support it? And it's different mindsets. I think even many people here probably participating to this webinar or this talk that are also invested, they probably also have a very short-term view. It's just a shift in mindset that we need to change reporting, to change to something that is more material from a company and investor perspective, keeping in mind that an EPS is just a number that might change the next quarter.
Right. Well, that's an excellent point. And I say, again, I think if we were having this conversation in America right now, that might be a bit different. But we have another terrific question from Bob Mayers, which I'd like to hand to Nick, at least initially. I understand that we as investors need to support the transition. Does this mean, though, that we should not exclude certain industries, but actually focus on the improvement on E, S, and G factors of companies instead? I.e., should we be focusing on the journey that companies are taking to actually improve themselves, rather than saying, this is sinful, these are sinners, kick them out?
Well, no, I think that's the question of the moment, isn't it? Because I think increasingly we see increasing numbers of investors setting long-term targets, particularly for achieving net zero. Most of these are 2050. I think it's been really striking actually how a number of investors are now setting 2030 targets for alignment of their portfolios, which is not too far away, 10, 15 years away. So I think there's a whole series of ways in which you do that. Certainly engagement is one of those. Certainly supporting corporate strategy. I think the transformation of the Danish oil and gas company Dong into Ørsted, one of the companies actually I think is at the forefront of the just transition, is another one. I think actually withdrawing capital from companies which are aligned, are not aligned with those strategies and are showing no willingness to move. So I think that's happening through processes such as the Transition Pathway Initiative, which shows where companies are on this, and then where companies are showing no willingness to be part of that journey, as Wim was saying. I think it's perfectly reasonable for companies to withdraw their capital. We've talked a lot about equity equities, and there's a sort of phrase that's been used, which I think is interesting, is engage your equities but deny your debt. Now, that's the interesting piece about particularly sort of corporate fixed income. These are time-limited capital assets, and clearly it's the moment of refinancing, which I think is a really important point for investors to actually make clear their expectations about transition. So I think that's another dimension of this, not just on the equity side, but on the fixed income side, corporate debt, but also sovereign debt. So a broader range of strategies, but I think being target-driven about where we need to get to and driving corporate focus on that.
Right, right. Interesting. Another great question from Kelly Kirsch, who asks, do you think agreeing on the standards / KPIs should come from the private sector or be government mandated to be truly effective? I'd love to ask that to both Wim and Karim, because that's a burning issue right now, given that we have this sort of almost ideological split right now between the European Commission that's drawing up the green taxonomy. You've got European, regulators who are looking at things like TCFD and discussion about imposing a lot of standards, versus many industry groups, particularly in America, who say actually what we should be having is bottom-up standards arising from the market instead. So I'm curious, where do you stand on the question of whether it should be top-down or bottom-up? Perhaps Wim could start, and then we could hear from Karim on that. And we haven't got a lot of time left, so we'll have to be quite focused.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief here. It is very different from the current financial reporting standards. As you may know, financial reporting standards have two slates, one for the financial sector and one for what is considered the rest, industrial. For ESG reporting frameworks, it will be very different. It will be sector by sector. So I believe that corporates need to be involved because they know their business very well. They know what is the best way to measure. However, and that is something I believe is important, in terms of the objectives that needs to be achieved, I think governments need to play a role. This is policy. They have the responsibility to guide where they want to take society, and then it's for corporates and for independent regulators together with investors to come forward with frameworks that align with that objective, I believe. But corporates will play a very important role in guiding what is material from an ESG perspective, sector by sector, activity by activity.
Karim, where would you stand on this question?
Quick comment. I'll start by recognizing that if corporates try to do it by themselves, it lacks the credibility of being impartial. So having an independent perspective is key. And I would like to suggest that corporates and asset managers can eventually look to the IFRS on the one hand and the EOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commission, to regulate what is built in it, but what is built at least is pragmatic. So I see it as a work of co-construction to make sure it's effective, but has the independent rigor that I think will generate the confidence we all need.
Right. And since we have just 5 more minutes, one last 1-minute question for Wim, which I think is such a fantastic question I want to sneak in. If investors favor engagement over divestment, what does good engagement with companies most impacted by the transition look like from Wim's perspective? That's from Patrick McLaughlin.
Well, my answer is going to be very short here. I refer to that trajectory. It's really challenging companies on do they have a plan? Very simple. It's about governance and strategy, referring to TCFD and how they are planning to implement that plan. And engagement serves, first of all, the purpose of challenging if they don't have a plan. And secondly, if they have a plan, is following up on that, whether that plan is being reliably being implemented, because it's very easy to say, I have a policy you find on my website, but engagement serves the purpose of, but how do you put that into practice? Show us that.
Right. Well, thank you. That is a very nice way to finish, actually, because I think what's striking about this discussion is that in many ways, the whole ESG sector is growing up. It's growing up in the sense it's gone from being a minority pursuit to actually being very mainstream. The fact that almost 90% of people listening think it needs to be embedded in their capital allocation is very, very striking. I think it's growing up because people are increasingly moving from talking about simply concept and rhetorical flourishes and dramatic statements to actual tangible action, as Wim just said. It's growing up in the sense that people are scurrying to try and talk about the real nitty-gritty of things like accounting frameworks. How do you harmonize them? Who is actually going to be in charge of taking decisions about how to harmonize them? How do you actually present and engage with investors if you are a company trying to do that? But I think it's also growing up because as we recognize, it's not just about the E, but we need to embrace the S, the just transition vision that Nick has very much championed in recent years. People are realizing that it's a journey and it's about trade-offs. It's not about black or white. It's about many spectrums and shades of hopefully an improving pattern. And I think there's going to be a lot of discussion going forward about how you get both investors and companies, policymakers, and frankly, journalists to appreciate the sophistication of the kind of debate that's needed to push that forward. So certainly we at Moral Money are very committed to trying to illuminate these issues. I'm sure that many of you are having intensive discussions inside your companies and your investment committees. I know that Nick is talking a lot within the academic forum about how to frame these issues. But I think what this discussion has shown is that aside from the fact that these issues are getting embedded into investment decisions, there is also a strong recognition that it can't be done by any one group. It's going to require a lot of collaboration, a lot of cooperation, and a lot of dialogue. So we've had a good dialogue today. Apologies for my technical glitches that saw me go in and out a bit in the middle, but certainly I found the dialogue very interesting indeed, and I hope you did too. And I'll just say to all of you, best of luck in doing what Wim just said, turning words now into action. Thank you.